I have a strange feeling that my introduction is sort of a waste of the time that he could spend in speaking to us, because he's well known for all of us. Definitely for us at Kroc, he has shaped, in fact, much of our educational, much of our, I would say, thinking about peace studies and peace building. But I'll still give these introductory remarks. John Paul Lederach is Professor Emeritus of International Peacebuilding at the University of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute, and a Senior Fellow at Humanity United. He's widely known for his pioneering work in conflict transformation. He has been involved in conciliation work in Colombia, the Philippines, Nepal, and countries in East and West Africa. He has helped design and conduct training programs in 25 countries across continents. He's the author of 22 books, which I'm sure many of us use in our classes, including When Blood and Bones Cry Out, Journeys Through the Sound Space of Healing and Reconciliation, The Moral Imagination, The Art and Soul of Building Peace, that we heard references to in yesterday's lunch keynote address, and the journey toward reconciliation and building peace. I asked John Paul to do the impossible thing. He asked me, what do you want me to speak about? And I told him, oh, it's very, very easy. Just go to all panels, get a sense of what people are talking about, and then summarize it all in a 30-minute presentation. You could only ask that from John Paul and know that he will actually do that. And indeed, so I'm looking forward to hearing your concluding thoughts about this wonderful conference. Please join me in welcoming John Paul.
Hello, everybody. I want to tell you a little story. Now, everything in this story is true, except for the parts that I changed to make it a better story. And the title of the story is this: What I Saw When I Fell in the Petri Dish of the Mad Scientist. The story begins with our scientist about a year ago. Now, I don't particularly want to name names, though Asher Kaufman does come to mind. So let me diverge a moment from my story and ask you to lay down all of your forks and to stand up and give Asher Kaufman a robust round of applause. Thank you feels a bit insufficient for how you have gathered and herded this extraordinary space in the last few days. So now let us return to our mad scientist. He's not mad as in angry. No, it's, I think, more mad as in really cool, way out of the box. Because he kept wondering what people around him actually meant when they used the word field. Often prefaced with words like "are" and "we." It seems that we have a weird sense of we. Who is we? He kept wondering. And what if we just put all of the specimens that think they're a part of the we, what if we took all the varieties of the bacteria and little mosses who claim to form the field and just put them in a petri dish for 3 days? By the way, in this story, you in this room are the specimens of bacteria, molds, and little mosses that are growing in the petri dish. And you have been swimming around for the last few days in this mad scientist's idea. Now, 6 months ago, I got a call from Asher. Would I consider offering a keynote address at this little gathering? Then, about a month ago, I got another call. Might I agree to kind of shape my notes? He would always be, Asher is very kind when he asks you to do something. Would I kind of shape my notes to reflect what I see and sense in this gathering? And then, I could add any comments I might want to make that were, a part of the original keynote. You mean, I asked, you want me to wander around and wonder about what is going on in the petri dish? And then stand up in front of all the specimens and tell them what I make of this, what I sense and what I see? He said, yeah, that's about it. So, a number of you have been saying to me over the last few days, we look forward to hearing your keynote address. To which I have responded, so do I. It literally has been emergent. It took me 2 hours, actually, the day prior to this conference to work my way through the program to figure out which places I could land for an hour or so in order to get some sense of the whole that seemed to be going on. And I really had no idea what key to play my notes in. But here is what I sensed, what I saw, and more specifically, what I wondered. And by the way, I love the word wonder. Wonder as in awe, a childlike wonder that keeps you alive and noticing things that you don't fully understand. Wonder as in inquiry, the whats and the whys that incite the curiosity. Wonder as in playful, like tinkering artists that are connecting and imagining. So I have wondered how a group called Peace Studies and Peacebuilding could name itself by so many categories. Paulo Freire once wrote that the greatest of all human powers is the power to name. And I think it corresponds to his thinking that the greatest of all forms of dehumanization is to take away the power of naming. We seem here in this room to be searching for language, naming something that we feel but does not yet have an adequate or permanent name. This is actually quite proximate to the human condition. There are many things in this world that we feel, but that are not easy to language. I sensed that this space these last 2.5 days, at least for me, was quite different than an ISA or an American Sociological Association conference meeting, or even different from quite a number of the peace studies conferences that I've attended. But what made it different? What made it distinct? Well, since I'm a sociologist, I thought a quick survey of the specimens that are found here in this room might be both revealing and incite some curiosity. So, what we do as sociologists is we take surveys, among other things. And so the survey always comes with some categories that somebody names. So I'm going to try 3 categories and just see how the hands go up. Careful with the lifting of the hands that you're not throwing chicken or tofu. So here we go. And this is all self-identified. And don't worry if you feel tension about the category. First, how many of you across this room would primarily identify yourself as an academic scholar researcher? Everybody take a quick perusal. All right. Number 2, how many of you across this room would identify yourself primarily as a dedicated practitioner? You're engaged in doing this work. Okay, the sociologist in me says it's relatively half and half. This already gives me a distinct flavor. Now, how many of you find yourself somewhere in between? Okay. Our categories, at least in the feelings that I was having in the course of this particular 3 days, our categories are a little bit in flux. And I wondered, and I'm going to proceed by way of wondering a few things throughout this, I wondered about a shift I noticed. So one of these that I found rather prevalent in this last 2.5 days was that the kind of nudging edges that many of the panels were in one form or another grappling with seemed to push in 2 very different directions. So one nudge was very much in the direction of the global. And that horizon, the global, was distinct from what I think I might have heard 25 years ago, even if the same people had more or less gathered, because it might have been more toward the national and the international. But this was pushing toward the global. And it came back consistently to ask, how are we attending to the massive challenges our human family is facing? The second push or nudge was what I would call the hyperlocal. So the global was almost planetary in nature. And then on the other side, there was a deep push down toward the local. The hyperlocal, in that it often were about very specific locations and forms of engagement. So I want to wonder a bit in the things I notice around the global and the local. The global seemed to always attain a sense of urgency, a kind of a generational momentum that was pushing. What I noticed in the local was that it always held compelling examples of what is being led into by the people who actually have to live with what it is they're leading into. In the global, I had an intuition that the urgency had to do with a sense that rather than us being, as they're now saying here, I'm not sure it's global yet, rather than us being woke, okay, there's a few millennials around, I guess. Rather than us being woke, we seem to be in the wake. That is, I kept hearing people express a kind of behindness. In fact, it led to a small haiku in one session. Some of you know that I tend to haiku my way through life, so I'm always kind of listening for these. This haiku is very simple. Decades behind, not a decade ahead. Life in the 20-year gap. The 20-year gap. We are 10 years behind, if not a generation behind, where we should be to address the global nature of the challenges, when we should be a decade ahead. And that's creating a sense of a 20-year gap. And probably the sense of urgency by which increasingly this is being expressed. I have a sense that in this 20-year gap, we sense the need to shed old paradigms, but the new ones have not yet arrived. And possibly it leaves us feeling a bit naked. Maybe here we actually find the gift to that dilemma from the deep local and the wisdom traditions that were also very much a part of the conversation and space in these last days. The closer that we got to the local, the more we found hope, which is odd because that's not how it's portrayed across most of the media. The closer we got to the local in these last 2.5 days, the more we found hope, pockets of possibility, and the more we found women, youth, local wisdom, and tradition in the lead. The Youth Bulge, which is a very curious metaphor, the Youth Bulge in that context was never expressed as a problem to be managed, but in fact were the feet pounding a way forward. Energy, alive, and new. I have to confess that it seems to me like it has taken far too long to get here. Our global system of peacebuilding, while purporting to offer help, seems to continuously fulfill the purpose of privileging the external and marginalizing the local. I sense that we are bearing witness in these last 2.5 days, that we are bearing witness to the shedding and the shaking of the system. And I could not help but recall a piece of poetry that I wrote maybe as long as 20 years ago. It kept coming back. It's titled The Parasite. I have traveled the world on the backs of people whose lives are held together by the wars they fight. I have traveled the world on the backs of people whose lives are held together by the wars they fight. You can hear in that poetry the cry of the heart of the who am I and what am I up to. You can also hear, curiously, that parasites form part of an ecosystem. But here's what I've learned. In most ecosystems where parasites are prevalent, parasites are not in the lead. So I would like for just a minute to go back to my survey. But I want to ask a different question. And I actually would like this time for a few, whoever feels that this catches some of who you are, that rather than raising your hand, that you would stand up. So, how many of you in this room would say that you feel identified as part of your lived experience with a dedicated practice in some form of peace building that has been continuous and persistent for the range of 25 to 35 years. I'm just curious if those people in this room that feel they have been at the front line of this work for the past 25 to 30 or 35 years, if you would just stand up. So these are many of the backs that I was writing. Thank you. These are often, especially in the most local of the communities, the people who have shown me how to lead into sustained and persistent creative survival in some of the most challenging places around the globe. They are people with whom I have co-learned, and as I said in a recent talk that I gave, that I have taken up the long road of unlearning how it is that I participate in systems of harm. And it is precisely at the level of people who have taken this up vocationally. That is, it is the only way they can imagine to breathe and live, to find a way that we move toward the possibility of a better world rather than into the abyss of dehumanization. It is precisely those who carry that vocation who I think hold some of the keys for how both local and global can be linked. Because I wonder who is in the lead when we talk about the global and the local. And I imagine it more as a circle. Because one of the things that I found about a circle is that the 2 points on a circle that sit the closest together are at the same time the 2 points on a circle that are the furthest apart. So maybe it is in the absolute creativity genius of artists learning how to survive that we find where it is that we can locate a way forward in the challenges that are so significant across our globe. What do I mean by that? I sometimes wonder if the best people to talk to for understanding what's coming in the next 60 years to the remainder of this century would be the young women who leave Honduras and by foot make their way all the way to the border only to be sent back down into Honduras. That the genius and creativity that it takes to move in a direction to protect family and survive together is precisely the genius that we're going to need to figure our way through the things that none of us know exactly what to do about. I recently just heard on NPR, our national radio, and I only caught a snippet, and I haven't been able to trace it down because I was wandering around too many panels, that in the last 3 days, there was a document released, the most recent document on climate change, that was signed by 11,000 scientists. I have no idea how they achieved 11,000 scientific signatures. The only piece that I heard from the announcer on the radio was this little snippet. They are saying that in the coming decades, we will witness untold human suffering. Untold human suffering. So I wonder, how will we prepare our future generations to be present, persistent, creative, and compassionate in the midst of the waves of human suffering that is going to come to our families and our communities. We have no real concept of what it means to be a global family. Yet it is only by way of the global family that we can attend to the challenge of what is now emergent. I noticed these last 2.5 days that those people in the places where I was listening and seeing the images of the work, those people who sit with suffering, who sit with trauma, who have sat with the challenges of personal and systemic dehumanization, often were moving seamlessly between the arts and spiritual dimensions of humans seeking meaning. There was no need to create categories that separated that out. It was seamless, the way it had to stitch a way to be with that proximity to human suffering, to find ways to hold language and express the unspeakable. They seemed to be people who had transcended the need to somehow decide between the inner and outer world. They were able to attend to something that had multiple dimensions to it. And they were drawing from that as ways to actually be with what it was that they had to live with. At the same time, and I think many of us experience this, globally, we seem to be and living in very unmoored times. Unmoored means a boat that got disconnected and unanchored, adrift, not quite sure what is coming, but a sense that it's coming fast, and that there is the push of the populist impulse that says the only way to respond to that is to pull back and create walls built out by fear, protection, and keeping the others at bay. Some directly attach religious justification to that. Yet in our midst, in this petri dish, we found the spirituality of wisdom traditions and the imaginations of faith-inspired action to provide both anchor and commitment to rehumanization. Our greatest challenges, climate, pandemics, human mobility, to name just 3, have no regard for walls. You don't stop a pandemic by building a wall. You don't stop climate change by building a wall. You actually don't stop human mobility seeking belonging by building a wall. This is also true. Our preferred models of negotiation through tables of some form of representation have proven weak, and sometimes as weak as walls. I wonder how we will know what to shed and what to keep as new paradigms emerge. Will we be able to fall back to the models that over the decades we have developed in response to the situations that we have seen as we face these things that are equally defying of a wall as it is a table? And I think part of what we're seeing around the globe is that people are now moving toward the streets. They're speaking with feet. And the sense of urgency has become ever more powerful. So, traveling by car over these last few months, across some of the expanses of this country, including the Great Plains in the Southwest, I listened to an audible book that was offered in a little program I had to the landmark speeches of Martin Luther King Jr. The book was called A Call to Conscience, and it was curated by an extraordinary person, Claiborne Carson. Across his public career, about 12 speeches were chosen, some of them hard to hear for the less than adequate recordings that were provided. Each of those talks was introduced by a person who had actually been there or lived through those moments. I found myself mesmerized because I was carried back into the soundscape of young formative years. This was the voice that reverberated in our home. And I kept hearing three things from Martin Luther King Jr. Here are the three. He would always appeal to the fierce urgency of now. And then in nearly the same breath, he would point to persistence, often with this phrase, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. He would then come, very often, between these two temporal pressures, the urgency of now and the persistence needed for the long arc of history. He would come to a single word over and over again. And that word was inextricable. And he would use it as adjective. We are inextricably bound together, tied as tight as the shared future our children will live into. And he would appeal constantly to that notion that it was not possible to face the fierce urgency of now or the long arc that bends toward justice without finding a way to do it together. It reminded me of Wendell Berry. Yes, the mad farmer poet, who had this notion that all we need is within and between us. All we need is within and between us. So I wonder if the ecosystem we found in these 3 days, so diverse in inquiry and practice, from local engagement with trauma and healing to UN mandates for mediators, from explorations of structures of harm to youth provokers, from numbers that get crunched to dances and drums that get unfolded. I wonder if our diversity offers us a well of potential for what sits within and between us. Because we will need every iota of human genius, insight, and commitment to find our way forward as we navigate the challenges unfolding before our eyes. I was reminded that in my own work, I learned to pay attention to what was arriving at the margins of what I thought I was doing. The moral imagination, I sometimes refer to this as serendipity, the discovery by accident and sagacity of things you were not in search of, the along the way, the along the side. And I was reminded of a story that came from Lincoln University that I found at the front end of one of Langston Hughes' books of poetry, which is titled The Dream Keeper. And it is a story of a teacher who was writing about a lesson learned in class one day, who said that as the students came and brought in their textbooks, this was in 1928, Lincoln is a historically African-American college, school, that as the students filed in with their given textbooks, he noticed there was one fellow who was not paying attention. And he seemed to be doing a very offensive thing, which was he was writing in the edges of his textbook, which at the end of the school year you had to turn in, clean for the next year. And here he was writing on the edges of his textbook and was not paying attention to the lecture. So as the students filed out, the teacher waited and then grabbed this young fellow and pulled him up to the desk. And when everyone had gone, he said, "Open your book and read me what you wrote." So he throws open the book. Kind of shaking, he reads. "Hold fast to dreams, for when dreams go, life is a barren field, all covered with snow. Hold fast to dreams, for when dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly." Now the teacher looked a new time, looked up into the eyes of James Mercer Langston Hughes and saw a poet, the margins of the textbook. Became one of the most significant volumes of poetry exclusively written to African American children in a way they could be memorized. Every iota of human genius we will need to find our way forward. As I thought back across what I had heard in my wandering across these 3 days, I asked myself the question, what phrase or moment or image had I just experienced that was sticking in my heart in a way that my head couldn't forget it? So I thought that maybe rather than doing questions and answers, because I'm not going to have a single answer to any of your questions, I would like to share with you the two that came out this morning and that jumped out at me. And then I would like for you, wherever you're located around your table, to find at least one person, or if you prefer to do it in threes, to sit with somebody and say, what's something that stuck in your heart that you won't let your head forget, that you just experienced from the conversations and things that you've heard? And if you can, before you leave at your table, if you could write the phrases or moments, just simply. The crew here will pick them up, and we'll get some sense, another form of doing scientific surveys, some sense of what spirit seems emergent and that has created some form of stickiness. So here are my two. One from a person that I haven't had a chance to shake a hand with yet, Justin De Leon. Yes, you, right there, I see you. You don't know me, but I came to your session. Very first session, first morning, first half hour. And I could not get this image out of my heart the next 2 days. It was a question he asked, which was, how does the Lakota build a teepee? And how does it speak to their understanding of themselves and the world? But the image was, when he talked about the poles having been up in the form of the teepee, that they would come with the skins and the canvases, and they would wrap around the poles, and that the image in Lakota was the image of the mother gathering and holding the children. That's our century challenge. Who's going to hold? Who's going to hold the people of our family that are trying to find a place to belong? The second one came from somebody I actually know fairly well. Came from the conversation in Colombia from Montes de Maria, from Naum, who is a young youth leader, having navigated already in his young years quite a bit of conflict and armed conflict at that. We had hoped that he might actually be here, but of course, it's not easy to get visas when you're of African descent and you live in rural areas and perceived as potential problems for other countries. So he used WhatsApp. We were WhatsApping. And he was a part of the panel. And at one point he used this phrase: "We believe in peace because we have done it in the middle of a war." He couldn't be more right. So those are my two. I would invite you to take a few minutes to find somebody and to ask what stuck in your heart, and then find a way to jot it down, whether it's a phrase or an image. And thank you very much for this opportunity to be with you.
So when John Paul asks us to do something, I think we have to follow. So take 5 minutes and engage in a conversation with your friends next to you. And if you can just write, pick up pieces of paper and write your reflections. If you need pens, Ari is here. Just raise your hand.
Good afternoon. I don't want to stop these conversations from continuing to go ongoing, and feel free to stay here after. But I'd like to just ask for your attention for a brief moment. I just have a couple of housekeeping announcements first. One, we are recycling name badges, so if you want to drop those off at the Kroc office, we'll take care of that. Also, please do leave your sheets of paper on the table so we can collect them afterwards and put them together. And I know that Asher has some closing remarks he'd like to make, but I just wanted to take a moment to recognize the instrumental role he has had in making this conference a reality. It was his vision to leverage Kroc's reputation and resources to bring together scholars and practitioners, including many of our alumni from around the world. For over a year, he has worked every day to make sure that the variety of voices from diverse experiences were part of the conversation. He made sure resources were available to those who needed assistance with travel and accommodations so they could be present and participate. In addition to his strategic role in securing experts to participate, including reaching out to each of our phenomenal keynote speakers, he was also willing to do things behind the scenes that make this conference a reality, from hanging paintings late at night for an art exhibit to handwriting changes on a program insert. There was no task he was unwilling to do. And most of all, throughout the process, he has done all of this work with humility and a terrific sense of humor. So from all of us at Kroc, we feel gratitude that you are our director. Thank you, Asher.
Thank you very much. So I prepared some concluding remarks, but I'm actually not going to say them. At the table here, I heard a comment that they've never seen me blush. So, yes, I turned red. Usually, instinctively, when I see a community of 450 people, I go the other way. So this has been an exercise for me. And it would not have been possible without really the cooperation and the hard work of so many people at the Kroc Institute. I keep reminding us, staff and faculty, that we are a community, and this event, the planning of this event, was a demonstration of how much of a community we are. The staff that gave a hand, the volunteers that took the time this weekend, very long weekend, to help out, the faculty that was committed and involved in the planning and in the execution of this program. And I guess most importantly, it's actually you. You are the ones who made this conference such a successful event. And I liked John Paul's analogy that this conference was like a well, not much of a petri dish, but a well. And it is a unique, it was in fact a unique well that we as peace studies scholars, practitioners, as peace builders, we actually need to think about that and the future of the field, because we will need, as John Paul told us, we will need every iota of us as humans in order to be able to get together and confront these challenges. And this well that this conference became, in fact, I think it filled a certain gap in our very broad field. Many of us go to ISA, but ISA, I mean, to be honest, we are marginal for this huge enterprise of ISA. And at ISA, you don't see the theologians and the artists and the historians and the computer scientists and the astrophysicists. And I'm mentioning here disciplines that actually were present in this conference. You just do not see them. And you need the artists and the astrophysicists and the engineer and also the social scientists to get together and figure out these synergies that are so desperately required so that 20 years from now we can say we have actually caught up with these challenges. And then we were able to go to John Paul and we said, we heard you and we've made it. So I have been asked time and again, and Aaron have also been asked this question. So are you having this conference again next year? No. But we are going to debrief after we take, I guess, a long 24 hours of sleep, and figure out ways for the future, because for the future of the field and creating a space like this for all of us to come together and to make sure that scholars and practitioners meet together, people from the global north and the south meet together, and join not just in a conversation, but actually working together in order to advance their ideas and their practice for the betterment of our children, the next generations that will come. So again, thank you again for all of you for coming from all over the world, and many thanks for the team that has been so dedicated for the past year to make it happen. Thank you very much.